Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Academy of Healthcare Science webinar. My name is Stephen O'Connor. Today, I've got apologies from Professor Brendan Cooper, President of the Academy. He is unfortunately speaking at this very same time as a healthcare science meeting in Wales and sends his apologies. An additional apology comes from Dr. Zyba Patel. She is caught up with her company in responding to FDA questions on a product, and as I'm sure you would imagine, sort of time can mean an awful lot of money in those circumstances, so we will miss her presentation. So today we're going to continue our Academy of Healthcare Science webinar series on scientific leadership around artificial intelligence. We're delighted to have two speakers at the cutting edge of AI in current clinical services. We're going to focus on applications within respiratory and cardiac medicine. And these are actively supporting physiological teams today. These examples may offer an insight into solutions for other physiological and scientific diagnostic services to reduce the logjams of daily clinical practice. So the first talk today is from Julie Mays, who is product manager at Arctic in Leuven, Belgium. Julie's a biomedical engineer and is the product manager of diagnostic solutions at Arctic. This is a spin-off company from the University Hospital in Leuven in Belgium. The mission of this company is to empower respiratory professionals with AI to accurately and in a timely fashion diagnose, treat and follow up patients with lung diseases. The Arctic team focuses on applications for lung function testing in both primary and secondary care, as well as for pharmaceutical clinical trials. The technologies have been extensively validated in collaboration with leading experts and institutions in the respiratory space, several of which have resulted in peer-reviewed publications. Julie is going to answer the question for us of how can AI support respiratory physiology. Julie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for the kind introduction. Very happy to be here today. With all of you, I've heard that there's quite some audience, so that's great honor. So as Simon says, I want to talk to you today about a couple of ways that AI can support us in respiratory physiology. And the reason why we focus on respiratory, because lung diseases are a major healthcare issue around the globe. And I pulled a couple NHS numbers up here because we're in a UK focused audience. So the lung diseases and, for example, COPD are really a priority for the NHS and also part of the long-term plan from the NHS. And the reasons are very obvious. There's 9.9 billion was already pre-pandemic being spent on lung conditions every year by the NHS. There's over 700,000 emergency hospital admissions that can be linked to lung conditions. And it's estimated that many of these could be avoided if there's earlier and more appropriate care for those patients. And up to 20% of deaths can be linked again to respiratory diseases or lung cancer. So a very important space in the healthcare industry, and that's why we've been focusing on these type of patients. Now, if we think at one of the issues that there is in this space, it's linked to diagnosis. If we think about COPD, it's a large group of patients, and we see that depending on literature, it's estimated that up to 80% of those patients are undiagnosed at the moment. If we look at asthma, we see that there's a lot of misdiagnosis there. Up to 1/3 of patients is estimated to be on the wrong, have the wrong diagnosis. And then if we think of some more rare but also very progressive diseases such as pulmonary fibrosis, we see that it typically takes 2 to 3 years for a patient to go from symptoms to a final diagnosis. And so what that and maybe an example from the NHS specifically, from UK specifically, there's estimated that about 2 million people in the UK live with undiagnosed COPD. So a huge group of patients that are undiagnosed today. And so what are the consequences? The consequences is that those patients have no treatment. If you're not diagnosed, you don't have treatment. One of the reasons for these numbers of emergency visits as well, we see that COPD patients coming to the hospital in an emergency situation, 1 out of 3 typically didn't have their diagnosis prior to that emergency visit. So also didn't have any treatment to control their disease. Of course, if you have a wrong diagnosis, there's a very likely chance that you are also on a wrong treatment. And I believe here there was an NHS study where they looked at asthma patients specifically, and where they found that 1 out of 3 patients that they then referred in that study to secondary care were found to be on inappropriate inhaled therapies. So lots of, resources not well spent with these patients because they were not helping the patients. And obviously, if you get a very late diagnosis, you only get a very late opportunity to be in treatment. And for progressive diseases, such as, for example, lung fibrosis, this makes a huge difference in survival rate, but also quality of life that has been lost already. Because for lung fibrosis, for example, the medication today can only slow down the progression of the disease, but cannot reverse the disease. So what is lost for these patients. So time is really quality of life for these type of patients. So that's why we focus on respiratory diseases, and we focus specifically on pulmonary function tests. And the reason we started there is because what we see is that they're really the main tool that physicians have to evaluate the respiratory system. So in this picture, you see a typical setup from secondary or tertiary care, where there's really both dynamic, static lung volumes are measured, and also the capacity of your lungs to take up oxygen. And so that is really something that is done typically very early on in the patient pathway, so covers a broad group of patients. And although these tests give you a lot of information, it is not that easy to do the interpretation of these tests. First of all, there's a huge amount of tests being done, meaning that there's a lot of time needed to really interpret and report on all these tests. To give you an example, here in the University Hospital in Leuven, there's over 20,000 tests a year done on pulmonary function tests done each year. So you can imagine, even if you need only a couple minutes per interpretation and report writing, that's a lot of report writing time. The second thing is that you really need to understand the physiology of the lung, and also how the tests work and how the measurements are performed to make a good interpretation. And we see that even between people who have a specialty in respiratory, there's quite some variability in the interpretation, and often the test gives first indications, but is often not specific enough to come to a final diagnosis. So for patients, that means that they often get additional testing done, sometimes redundant testing done. Sometimes patients get initial misdiagnosis, and all of that leads to increased cost to the entire system. Now, these are the things that we've heard. We've also tried to quantify that a bit. And so what we did is a study where we had 120 pulmonologists. So in the UK, you call these respiratory consultants. So specialists were coming from 16 different hospitals, and they each looked at 50 patient cases. And so what we saw is that to do those 50 patient cases in a multiple choice questionnaire interpretation way, they took about 150 minutes to do those 50 patients. If we then compare their answers to of describing the test results with the latest guidelines on how you should be interpreting those test results, we saw that there was an accuracy of 74%. And then we also asked them to say, okay, based on the test results and then the basic clinical information that they got on symptoms, age, some smoking history, okay, what is now the most probable diagnosis that you think about and that you would first investigate? And then we compared that with what we knew from the full patient file and expert panels, what was the true diagnosis. We saw that there was a match in 45% of the cases. And more so, there was big differences between the different specialists. So this here is a kappa score. A kappa score is 1 if every one of these physicians would have said the same, and would be 0 if everyone gave a different answer. So you see quite some variability between those experts. We also asked them to give a confidence score. And so if we filtered out only the cases with a high confidence score, we see some improvement in accuracy in being able to predict a final diagnosis, but not much. So based on this, we said, okay, there is room for improvement and room for help. And so we started looking, okay, how can we support this? And that's when we came up with the idea of what we call Arctic PFT, which is an AI-based software that will automatically process PFT data and then generate a report for the physician. And so the first part of the report is really describing the test results. And the goal here is to really make sure that there's consistency without expert time being spent on reporting. So what we do is making sure that the description is always consistent with the latest guidelines, but also that there's consistency between colleagues and maybe even between different departments or hospitals within the same group. So always the terminology is the same, the level of detail, the order of describing the test results, everything is always the same. Also, the levels of severity are always the same. You don't have a patient that is called moderate by one physician and severe by another physician, but it's always in line with the definition in the latest guidelines. So goal here is consistency and making sure that you don't spend expert time on typing reports. Then the second part is really where the AI and machine learning comes in. And what we did there is really train a model on cases where we not only had that initial pulmonary function test results, but the whole patient file and a full panel was absolutely sure of the diagnosis. And then a machine learning model took all that data to try to learn to recognize patterns in the pulmonary function test data. And so what we do here is giving a disease probability based on that machine learning model. And the reason we work with probabilities and not just one answer, for example, asthma here, is really to make sure that, first of all, we're very transparent about the uncertainty of the model. So if the model says, well, it looks a bit like this disease, but it also looks a bit like that disease, that is immediately reflected in those probabilities. And the second reason why we keep showing probabilities is to highlight again that this is a second opinion. We're not trying to overrule a doctor. We're trying to give the perspective of the AI based on lung function data. And that should trigger the physician to either ask more questions or take the next step in a certain direction or prioritize certain next steps over other. So that's also why, so this is a couple examples of how it can look for different diseases. And so what we then do to focus really on those next steps is also give a conclusion and then give what are typical next steps that can be considered to either confirm or further deepen this type of diagnosis. So for example, for interstitial lung disease, the gold standard diagnosis is always done on HRCT and often with a multidisciplinary team. Since we're giving advice that can be used in the diagnostic process, it's considered a medical device, and so we're also CE marked under the MDR regulations. And with this solution, we've done over 200,000 pulmonary function test interpretations from clinical practice. We have a couple installations in multiple countries. So we've really started some installations in the UK, Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, Italy, Poland. So really starting to create our first users in different European countries. Now, of course, just developing this software doesn't guarantee any improvement in results. So the first thing we did is validating it. But before I go there, let's maybe focus on how does it work clinically. Because what you want to avoid when you add a new tool is that it becomes more work for the clinical staff, either for the doctors or for the physiologist who are performing the test. So it was very important for us to make sure that it completely fits within the clinical workflow. And how we do that is, this is their typical clinical workflow. So you have the pulmonary function test equipment, which typically comes with their own software. And then from there, results are sent to the patient record. And either the physician looks at the result there, or he looks directly in the pulmonary function test result, pulmonary function test software, and then approves reports there before they go to the patient file. So what we did is connecting with this the pulmonary function test equipment and keeping our core algorithms in the cloud. In that way, anonymized data is sent to our cloud, and immediately, less than a second later, the report is received back in the same location where all the test results are there. In that way, if there's updates in clinical guidelines or any other updates, they're immediately available to all users. And there's no strict requirements on hardware that can do tough computations on the side, so on the hospital side. And so really making sure that there's no additional work or additional software and tools that the clinical staff needs to work with. Now then, of course, validation, I think, is an important topic. And the first thing we did is kind of validating, is what we made accurate enough to provide that support and second opinion. So what we did is we took the same data from the previous study and then also gave that data to the software. And what we then see is that, yeah, first of all, computers are very fast in generating full reports. So it's almost immediately. Second thing is computers love following rules much more than humans. Once you've put in the rules of the guidelines that are active, they will not be confused about guidelines that were active in the past or personal opinions about guidelines. They will always follow the international guidelines. But the most striking results are on being able to predict or recognize the final diagnosis as most probable disease. So when we looked at the disease with the highest percentage, we saw in this data set an accuracy of 82%. If we then look at where percentages, the probability was very high, then we see that that even goes up to 98% in this data set. And then, of course, what is important is everyone, no matter who clicks the button, no matter if it's a Monday morning and you had a very refreshing weekend, or it's Friday afternoon after a week of hell, always you get the same result and the same second opinion. So that's very important for us too. Now, of course, these type of studies kind of compare the doctors with the AI. But in the end, we want to have them work together. And the first thing we looked at was what is the impact we can have on reporting time, because this is really time that is considered typically by clinical staff as administrative work and as work that is boring and not nice to do, not giving energy but taking energy. And so what we did there is we took 100 patient cases. We printed the latest ATS ERS, so the European and American guidelines, for the participants to have access to that and to have access to a summary. And we asked participants to reserve 1 hour where they could work uninterrupted. And what we had is we had 2 physicians and 2 pulmonary function experts, so it would be the equivalent of physiologists in the UK, which each more than 10 years of experience in pulmonary function testing. And so then we asked them, just start with the first case and work your way through. We'll see where you get in 1 hour. And so these are the results. And so what you see is that depending on the expert and the level of time and detail they took, but also maybe the level of familiarity with the latest guidelines, they did 9 to 24 case reports in that hour. So having about 3 minutes per, very similar to our previous study, needing about 3 minutes per patient case to report on this. And then we also compared in each of the different elements of the guidelines how well their results matched with what the guidelines are actually expecting. And you can see that none of the experts had 100% match. You see that some people didn't comment on a severity. Some people were sometimes confused within, for example, here the definition change. So what we saw here is that the expert was confused with the previous definition in the from the previous guidelines, not the new ones. So you really see some variability showing up. And then we looked at what the software can do, where that can prepare, much more than even 100 patient cases in that hour for you, fully in line with the guidelines. So that's the first thing, is improving that reporting time. But then the more exciting part, where really the AI, the power of AI comes across, is of course how can we impact the diagnostic process of patients. And so there we took the same cases as we the new cases. So we took 24 cases who were unrelated to the previous cases, also completely new to the software. And we had 62 pulmonologists from various institutions across Europe. So was an online study, so we had multiple countries and nationalities in there. And so what we asked them to do is to look at those 24 patient cases, first individually, and then with the support of our Arctic PFT report. And we asked them about their primary and differential diagnosis and a confidence score. And what we saw as a result of the AI support is that they increased their diagnostic accuracy, and also they improved their confidence score. So we could see really an improvement on both levels. Now, what we did in this study as well is we included a couple extra cases where we knew the AI was wrong. So initially we started from a bit more than 24 patient cases to be able to select a couple extra cases where the AI was wrong, because we wanted to see, is there really teamwork going on, or do the physicians just start following the AI? And what we see is that there's a limited automation bias. So you see that what typically happens is when the AI gives a different answer than the physician was initially thinking about, he will go back and look at the data to understand what the AI is seeing. And so we see a huge improvement for diseases that initially leave very subtle signs on the lung function data, but are really clear patterns if you take all the subtle signs together, because really the AI has the ability to recognize that, flag that, and then it's easy for the physician to kind of recognize what was maybe not very obvious at first sight. So very encouraging results on the teamwork between the AI and the physicians. Now, I've talked a lot about the specialist setting where we have respiratory consultants, hospitals, but very important is also primary care, because patients only get to a hospital typically after being referred or being helped first in primary care. And in primary care, spirometry is a lung function test that is important. And in the UK, there was a complete stop of spirometry during the pandemic in primary care. And there's huge efforts ongoing to really restart that and really also bring that to the next level. And what is happening in spirometry is, again, it's going to measure your lung function. And then it's used for both the diagnosis of respiratory disease and the follow-up of these patients. So it's an important test, and it's really being restarted, and a lot of effort being done on providing this in primary care at a good quality level. Now, what's the difficulty of spirometry in primary care? Is that there's often a lack of training and expertise. And that's not very surprising. People in primary care need to know a bit about every aspect of the healthcare, about the different disciplines. And they're often in a more isolated setting, where in the hospital you're surrounded with a lot of people who all have expertise in respiratory. Often in a primary care setting, the person performing or interpreting spirometry is typically the only one who has some form of respiratory training. And so there's two main aspects that are important. The first thing is providing a quality measurement, because performing spirometry, for people of you who haven't done it yet, is not that easy. As a patient, it's very important to do it at maximal effort and to do it in the right order of steps. And just to give you an idea on the complexity, these are all the criteria that need to be fulfilled for it to be a good quality test. So you can imagine, if respiratory is not your only focus, this is a lot. What makes it even more difficult is that half of these criteria are really depending on visual inspection of the curve of the data by an expert. You cannot just calculate the criteria. So that's really making it difficult to make sure that you have good quality spirometry. And then the second element is then doing the interpretation. And there's a couple numbers, but that are typically looked at, but there's a lot of numbers that come out of this spirometry measurement, and there's curves coming out of there, and subtle changes in the shape of the curve can give you a lot of information. But again, it's not that easy to just pick that up when you're in a primary care setting. And so that also explains why a study in the NHS found that there are poor levels of agreement in spirometry interpretation between primary care and specialist respiratory physicians. So what we aim to do here with AI is really, can we bring specialist level expertise into all levels of care? And how we do that is, again, by using an AI-based software. The interpretation is very similar to what I showed you before, but then before we go to that interpretation, we add a step where there's a quality feedback. There's feedback on the quality of the test performed, and that allows people to go back and ask the patient with very specific instructions to do the test again and come to a better quality measurement. And so really it translates all those criteria that we saw on the previous slide, also the ones that depend on visual inspection of the data, with feedback to the person that is performing the measurement. And it's for that visual, those visual assessments, or visual criteria, that we again use AI and deep learning techniques to look at the shape of the curve, again, instantaneously, so that you can immediately get feedback. So how does it work? Again, very similar as the last time, as in secondary care, sorry. We link with the spirometry software immediately, so that there's no interruptions in the general workflow, and our reports go together with the results of the measurements as it's currently implemented. Now, there's a lot of validation that can be done. We've done validation first on the accuracy of the quality control element. And as Simon said in the introduction, we do some work in respiratory clinical trials as well, where spirometry is used, and the quality of spirometry is extremely important. So we've done a huge amount of studies to prove the accuracy and the extreme accuracy of our algorithms there. So I'm not going to run through each of them, but if we have the opportunity to share the slides, you can click on the different studies there. Then the second thing is, of course, validating again the accuracy of the interpretation support and the diagnostic support. And there, next to what we did in secondary care, we also added some validation on the UK Biobank to have data that is a bit more closer to a primary care population. And we're really at the end of a project that was funded with an artificial intelligence in health and care award by AHCS. So there the publication is currently being written up and made ready for publication, where we showed in NHS primary care data how accurate the interpretation support of the software is. But then I think what is again important, it's not just showing that to the accuracy of the two elements, but also how they impact when they're integrated in the care pathways. So we've done 2 studies in Belgium, smaller studies, where we got feedback from the physicians, the GPs, on how they liked the support, and we also saw how they were following or not following the support and how they improved both their confidence levels in doing spirometry, but also the quality in both performing their spirometry and interpreting the results. And so as part of that artificial intelligence in health and care award, we also have a couple of projects that are finalizing in UK primary care to again show the impact there, both on the accuracy of getting patients' diagnosis, but also on the quality of life and the health economic impact this technology can have. So there's not much results yet I can share there, but I would really invite you to follow our LinkedIn channels or any of our channels, because we'll definitely be updating, sharing updates there when there's results that are published or presented in academic settings such as conferences. So with that, I want to thank you all for the attention. I leave my email here as well. If there would be any questions, not only after the presentations here, but if you have any questions later, you can always email me. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julie, for a very insightful presentation. There's a lot to pick up on that. If anybody in the audience has any questions, could you please put them into the Q&A box on this platform, and then we'll come to them at the end. And I'll pick your name and ask you to present your question in person rather than me reading it out. So thank you again, Julie. Thank you very much. So what I would like to do is our second presenter, Dr. Jose Alonso Solis Lemus, to present on AI advances in cardiology. Jose is a research software engineer with a PhD in biomedical engineering from City University of London. He's currently a postdoctoral research associate at the Cardiac Electromechanics Research Group at Imperial. Jose specializes in developing algorithms for advanced cardiac image analysis to be used by researchers and clinicians alike. His interests include open source initiatives and promoting reproducible science. He creates reproducible pipelines for patient-specific cardiac models, bridging scientific advancements to the clinic. Jose, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Steven. Thank you for that. Thank you everyone for attending. My name is Jose Alonso. Jose for short is fine. And I'm really glad to be here. I'm really glad to be able to present a bit of the side of what comes from the research side, from working at a university. I will try to showcase some of what we do that's similar to what a lot of the groups do, and a bit of what we do that we think is a bit special in terms of going beyond the research output. So I want to start first by acknowledging everyone in the team. Obviously, this is a very large team spanning a lot of universities, and in the UK and in Europe. We're currently working at Imperial, but we started as a group in King's College. And so I just want to take a moment to acknowledge everyone's work here. And for us for today, what I want to do is to do a bit of an overview of our research here at CMERGE, the Cardioelectromechanics Research Group. Then what is multi-scale approach in terms of what do we mean by attacking a problem from different scale levels? And how does that become complex computationally, and how we can reduce the complexity using AI? Then a big part of our work involves patient-specific cardiac models, and those are difficult to make in short. And so I'm going to show how we approach this problem as well. And finally, how do we propose expanding beyond our research? So in terms of motivation, I think this fact sheet from British Heart Foundation is super useful. I would encourage people to go and look it for themselves as a whole document. But a few figures. We have 7.6 million people living with heart and circulatory diseases in the UK. It's heart problems are take up 2 of the biggest killers in the UK. This is from 2022, and we have 175,000 annual deaths from heart and circulatory diseases in the UK. That's larger than, for example, the population of the city of Oxford, which is a lot. And even though they show the decline of numbers, it's still a very sizable number, and it's still something that we want to address from many different angles, research being obviously one of them, the key ones. And so what do we do at our group? We mostly we try to work from all aspects of cardiac research, all the way from basic science, understanding what the proteins do, or understanding what the cell is doing, all the way to tissue level, then to organ level, and then to system level. We try to understand the underlying forces that are being applied there, and then we try to move on to clinical applications, doing clinical trials, doing investigating, understanding diseases, arrhythmias, heart failure, atrial fibrillation, and so on. And we have a very specific, patient-specific research area of our group. We are mostly a computational modeling group, and our application is the heart. Now, what do I mean by multi-scale process? Well, imagine adjusting your glasses and that having an impact on a global scale. That's sort of the difference in order of magnitude from moving something at the protein level, which is in the order of micrometers, all the way to moving something in the body, right? And we try to address each of these scales with our computational models. Now, at each level, we will have mathematical rules and mathematical models that will describe what is happening. And as we go up a level, so from proteins to cells, and from cells to organ, and from organ to body, we are compounding variables on top of each other. So heart disease, we can hit any and multiple of these scales, and we know this, and this can lead the whole system to fail. However, cardiologists normally can only measure some organ properties. And so in order to be able to treat our patients the best way possible, we need to know what exactly caused the symptoms and at which level these symptoms are being caused. And so this is the first aspect that I wanted to share, because this is different from what maybe the common knowledge of AI and how it can help is. So we start from our molecular processes, where we study ion channels, contractile proteins. We study at that very low level. And then we try to incorporate it with a patient-specific whole heart model into understanding the electrical activity. So that is the colors that you're seeing moving on the image, and also the mechanics of it. And what we can do here is we can assign different tissue properties. If, for example, there's scarring on the left atrium, or if there's scarring on the right ventricle, and that's going to have an impact both in the electrical activity in the heart and in the mechanics of the heart, right? And because of this multi-scale approach, we have embedded, let's call it numbers, from the equations that regulate the ion channels and the molecular processes, all the way down to the organ level. And so, as you may imagine, this requires many hours on a high-performance computing facility. And if we want to know where is the problem, that's difficult, because then we would need to run hundreds of simulations or thousands of simulations, and each one might take many hours on a very high performance computing facility. That's not only costly time-wise, it can be costly economically. Hiring this high performance computing facilities can take a lot of money as well. So what we've come to use is an AI tool called a Gaussian process emulator, and these are a statistical model that can help us simulate complex relationships between different variables. And that's exactly what we have. We have different variables, we have different parameters or numbers from all of the levels in our stack, and we can understand how they relate to each other, and how and then use this tool to predict outcomes and to know exactly where the problem might be lying. The benefit here is that this process, what's going to do is it's going to require a lot less time and a lot less computing power to run. So, and therefore we can do a global sensitivity analysis. So if we go back to our scale, just to keep it in mind, thanks to the sensitivity analysis, we can link clinically measurable outputs with all scales of the cardiac function. And so it's going to look a bit, hopefully this is readable. At the bottom, you will see a bunch of parameters, and these are different parameters from different scales in the models. And the how dark each of the points are will determine which one of these parameters are relevant in which areas. So in this particular example, some of the parameters are system-wide parameters, and they will be relevant to this particular case. And this is something that we were able to do with very few simulations and not a lot of computing power. And that is one of the very key aspects of AI that we can take advantage of, is to reduce complexity, help us figure out patterns between variables without having to run a lot of simulations, right? So then let me move on now onto patient-specific anatomical models. And this is a big part of what we do in the group as well. What I mean by patient-specific is exactly that. We're going to take a scan from a patient, and then it's going to go through a series of steps where we will be able to create a model in which we can run simulations, and we can either inform what's happening, understand what's underlying processes. And the way it works is, this is a CT image, for example. It's essentially a photograph, but in 3D, but most of you will be familiar. We're going to be doing a segmentation that is identifying each of the parts of the heart in the image. From there, we can move on into a process that's called meshing. That means changing from an image into what's called a cloud of points, which are interconnected with each other. And then finally, because these are important to understand how electrically how the heart transfers electricity from one place to the other, we need to learn where the fiber orientations are, right? So we would do this process, and then from there we have a model that we can understand the electrical activity as well as the mechanical and the mechanics of the heart. Okay, so how do we approach this this process? We have a software platform for cardiac image analysis. This is a platform that we've built from open source libraries. It's open source itself. Anyone can download it. Anyone can use it. It's free to use. It's and it runs on standard laptops. It runs on any sort of computer, and it has all of our custom image processing and computer vision tools. It can perform statistical machine learning and simulation approaches, and it allows the study of physiology, pathology, inform a diagnosis, and treatment. In a few words, we want to enable, through this application, we want to enable cardiovascular clinical researchers to perform very advanced image analysis with very limited training. The idea, as Julie mentioned very well in her presentation, sometimes the experience is key for a process to work. And so we want to lower the bar in terms of someone being able to perform these processes. I should say that this is a research tool at the moment, not a clinical tool. We have the idea of CE marking it, but that's, I think, a couple of years down the line. So it should not be used for diagnosis or treatment. Why would we do this? So I described the process, right? Going from an image to a segmentation to a mesh with fiber orientations. That process, and this is common often in research, but it'll be a very long process. For example, on the right, I have a standard operating procedure to do one of these processes, where there's a lot of changes between different softwares, and there's a lot of opening folders, opening files, changing something, closing, opening something else, running some code, changing again, opening, changing, and so on. This process can be very involved, but it can be very difficult. It can feel somewhat like this, where it's a process that, even though this is software that that has been developed carefully and that works, it might take 4 hours to run, or it might take 3.5 hours to do one single case. Now, this is not ideal, and therefore we have created this application to try and combine some of these tools and make it easier for the user and make it more accessible to understand and to run. And so what we've come is something like this. We have an application where mostly we will see a series of steps that a clinician or a researcher can follow, and that's going to allow them to do various tasks, whether it's a simple segmentation, so finding out the what area of the heart we're interested in, whether it's registration, trying to align different modalities, so maybe a CT with an MRI or an MRI with a with something else, align them so that you can match them and visualize them better, and perform tasks measuring weight, measuring diameter, measuring sphericity, all those sorts of things, and try to do that in the simplest way possible. The key features we have are image processing on one side, so tasks that do image processing, registration, segmentation. We do mesh manipulation. This is operating on these point clouds effectively and efficiently. We have our own in-house algorithms, and we try to plug in collaboration from other groups. Now, a lot of this, when we started a few years back, they were classic image analysis tools. So they would be also very involved. The clinician would have to segment manually the atria, for example, or the heart. And what we're doing now, we're moving these from classic image analysis into AI-driven pipelines. And so I'm going to give a couple of examples of this. For example, we have a fully automated atrial fibrosis assessment using multi-level convolutional neural network. What that is it's a tool that allows the clinician not to have to go and manually identify all the voxels that correspond to the atrium, to the left atrium, but the machine will do it itself, right? It works fairly well, and it also, on top of that, it identifies not only the blood pool and the shape, the overall shape, but it'll tell you where the veins are, where the mitral valve is, which are important for the analysis. And at the end, it gives you a sense of how scarred the tissue around the atrial wall is, which is important to know how the electrical signal moves through the organ. The second example we have is a whole heart segmentation. Again, this is a neural network, which various steps. This was a very good, very impressive work by how he works at the moment with Alistair Young at King's, and he was able to give us a whole segmentation of the entire heart, all the ventricles, all the atria, the aortic valve, the blood pool, the myocardium of the left ventricle, all of that in a matter of maybe a minute or so, which is very important because it shaves off a lot of the time, and that's partly what we're trying to do, like try to make this more efficient. Now, moving beyond research, as I mentioned before, we try to take complex pipelines and try to integrate them into a software platform. And so what we're trying to do with this is, through a reproducibility study, we want to demonstrate a pathway for these workflows to transcend its immediate scope. Unfortunately, sometimes what happens in research is you will create a pipeline such like the one I have on the right. It'll create a few publications, 2 or 3 publications, and then it will not be used because it's hard to do, and because it's not clear to do, even with all the instructions and everything laid out properly. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to transcend the research, the immediate research scope. And for that, we did for that, I moved this pipeline into our application, the Semerge app, and we did a reproducibility study. What we did was we took 5 users, we took a number of 50 cases. We gave each user 20 cases to process randomly. They were repetitions, and we asked them to use the application to create a fibrosis map and to create a model with atrial fibers. We did comparisons between interoperator variability and intraoperator variability. That is the same user doing a case twice, or 2 users doing the same case. That's to ensure that even if different operators are using the software, can we prove that the output is going to be the same, which is, it's taking us back a little to what Julie was saying, which is very important. And finally, we did some tests to assess how different the results were. In short, we reduced the model building time from 4.5 hours to under 20 minutes. That was one of our biggest points. And this pipeline used a lot of used the atrial segmentation tool that I described before to speed some of these processes, and we were able to measure that the impact of the operator variability was similar of the impact that you would see from the image resolution. So very low, almost negligible impact from different operators, which was fantastic. And so this type of studies, we are hoping that this is going to support upcoming frameworks for generating patient-specific atrial models. But because this was the first simulation study we're hoping that this will become a template for other simulation studies. And because we have already a pipeline, we can expect to run larger studies with larger cohorts. Instead of 50 cases, maybe we can throw in 200 or 300, because UK Biobank, and there's many sources of data where we can use and to make even larger studies, hopefully to more precise and useful outcomes. And so whether if you want to give us a follow, we don't spam a lot, so feel free. And I just wanted to leave a very quick take-home message. Our research at CMERGE highlights the significance of a multi-scale approach in cardiac modeling, demonstrating how AI reduces computational complexity, as we saw with the Gaussian processing at the beginning. Patient-specific cardiac models facilitated by our CMERGE app platform showcase a common ground for cardiac research, where we have, apart from the group, we have like 5 other groups worldwide using our platform, trying to push forward their own research with their own questions. And through automation with AI, we streamline the task, and we propose expanding our impact beyond research, emphasizing the importance of reproducibility in advancing cardiovascular studies. So, thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose. Again, a very enlightening talk. We do have a number of questions within the Q&A. Could I start by asking Caroline Jacob, please, to ask her question? Can you unmute Caroline Jacob, please, Will?
Hi, yes, I have unmuted, but if she can't, it might be easier for you to read it out for her.
Okay. Would the AI software be able to identify if spirometry is poorly performed? If so, does it manage to do a valid interpretation?
Yeah, that's I think a good question. So what we see is we make a difference here between primary and secondary care. So typically we see in secondary care, spirometry is performed by ARTP trained and accredited physiologists who really know what they're doing, are surrounded by specialists in their team. And so there we typically don't check the quality. In primary care, we really saw that that is a key aspect, to first check the quality of the spirometry performed before going to an interpretation. And so indeed, what the algorithm does is first checking the things that you can measure, things such as the time to end of expiration, or if there's a plateau in the end. But then where the AI comes in is in really visually assessing the curve. So is there an immediate sharp rise of the flow volume curve? Is there a good peak that shows maximal effort? Those type of things. And so that is checked first. Now we also, in the study that's ongoing with the AI award, we have also looked at what if we just put in the bad quality spirometry sessions anyway for interpretation. And there we do see that it depends on the disease where that has an impact. The reason is because we look at multiple points on the curve. The AI looks at multiple points on the curve, not just at FEV1 and FVC. And what we see is, for example, for asthma, there's a big impact. We're going to overestimate asthma if there's bad quality, for example, submaximal effort spirometries. But we see for diseases such as COPD, for example, where the shape of the curve is pretty characteristic, and it's that piece of the curve that is maybe less influenced by having the exact maximal effort or the exact maximal expiration. There we see that impact is smaller, but still good quality data is important, and that's also indeed why we put in that AI piece that looks at quality in primary care as a first step.
Lovely, thank you very much for that answer. Nathan Hall asks whether you can share the UK installations that you are working with.
I cannot share everything, but I can share the sites that it's where it's clear that we work with them. So you'll see that a lot of the work we do in primary care in that AI award is with the group at Royal Brompton, the group of William Mann. William Mann is co-lead of the project as well. So we obviously do a lot of work with them. And then one of the first users we had in the UK is the North Bristol Hospital. So they've also already communicated that they work with our technology. So those are, let's say, the two main things I can share from secondary care. From primary care, there are a couple of project-based things, such as there's a project in Glasgow ongoing on spirometry in primary care. And then there's a very cool project in the Football Club of Everton, where the charity of the football club and AstraZeneca have worked together to bring together a breathlessness hub, where both for heart failure and for lung diseases, mainly COPD, there's screening done, and there also we support that spirometry effort. So those are a couple of the sites I can talk about.
Very nice to hear my favourite football team being mentioned in a nice way. Thanks for that answer. Jan Stanker asks, how does Arctic PFT deal with interpretation of data that are not technically the best? For example, if the Z-score for FEV1 FVC ratio was normal and minus 1.4, but there was an obvious early termination of the spirometry manoeuvre, which underestimated FVC and therefore overestimated FEV1 FVC ratio.
Yes, so I think it kind of links to the previous question. So there will be an influence of that, and that's why mainly in primary care we add that AI piece that checks quality of data as well. As said before, the AI looks at more than just FEV1 and FVC. It looks at multiple points on the curve. So depending on which disease, that might have a bigger or lower influence. So in this case, there will be some influence. For example, might think about if there's a component of a restrictive disease there, but the shape will still always make the AI still think about those obstructive diseases, because it doesn't work with those fixed cutoffs, but really looks at patterns.
Right, lovely. Thank you for that. Professor Caroline Lee from City University, many thanks for the talk, which is very interesting. ECG seems to be missing from this multi-scale approach. What are your thoughts about integrating ECG or other wearable signals into the framework?
Hi, Caroline. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, so ECG, I think that would fall within the multi-scale approach. It would go right at the top, like on the body thing, on the body scale. We have a few studies where, so we have a few models where we do the modeling, and we have a whole model of the torso, and then we can simulate ECG and we can compare. So this would be the part of understanding the underlying, what the heart state is doing to the visual ECG signals. So that's one part. I do think we have a few studies, although they escape my mind at the moment. But if you drop me an email, I'll reply with examples where we have used we have both used ECG and imaging data to answer. I think it has to do with cardiac resynchronization therapy and whether you can predict if this type of therapy is going to impact something. And finally, what I can tell you in terms of wearable signals, we're just starting to break into that space. We had a very small pilot study. We just finished it. We were wearing, everyone in the lab was wearing a little watch, we're trying to gather data to see if that type of information can be fed into our models and to enhance them. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Great, thank you. There are a couple more questions coming in here. Whilst I sort those out, Jose, you had a question for Julie. Could you ask that question yourself while I look for it in the posts?
Happy to. So thank you, Julie, for your talk. You mentioned in one of your examples that doctors there was a case specifically that caught my eye where doctors weren't following wrong AI suggestions, and I just want to know if you can talk a bit more about what did you learn about these mismatches between doctors and the model's output? Like, did that inform a new version of the model, or did anything come out of that? Like, I'm just interested for you to elaborate on it a little. It was very interesting.
You're on mute. You're on mute, Julie.
Yeah, sorry. So in that case, we selected in that study a couple of cases where we knew the AI was wrong. So in the study itself, we just used it to see how do the doctors deal with that. Like, would they just, is there a risk of them let's say following wrong suggestions? Because we see the suggestions, the accuracy is very high, but it's not perfect, and I don't think it will ever be perfect. And what we really see happening, and it's also what I see happening when I do a couple example cases with respiratory specialists, is when the AI says something that surprises them or that doesn't match what they initially had thought, they go back and look at the data, and then they try to see the signs, and what they are often trained to see is, for each parameter, is it normal or is it abnormally low or maybe abnormally high? But usually it's between normal and abnormally low. And so even the reports give, let's say, a green, orange, red light on those type of reports. And what the AI does is, even if things are still in the green, but they are starting to go to what is called the lower limit of what is still called normal, that's where the AI doesn't care about where that limit is, because it just looks at patterns overall. And so it's really those type of cases where we see that the doctors really follow the AI. Now, sometimes the AI just makes a mistake because it looks at those patterns. For example, it also takes into account smoking history, but sometimes you just have, if you have someone who has never smoked and shows an obstruction, for example, and you've not done a bronchodilator response to see if the obstruction is reversible, the AI might think about COPD still, because it doesn't know if that obstruction is reversible. But then in the clinical information, a physician might see that there's a history of allergies, and so that makes asthma a much more viable option. So it's those type of cases where the doctors have a bit more information, and so what we try to do is kind of see what is reasonable information that is available in a structured way at the point of that first visit, where we can add most value to help improve the accuracy of our models. So that's what we look at. And so, for example, we tried in secondary care to look at do symptoms help? But we see it doesn't really help, because all these patients have the same symptoms. They're short of breath and they're coughing. And so the model isn't really, it's just starts ignoring the symptoms, and it's something that's a bit more hard to put in clinical practice, so we took it out. But we obviously, things where we know we obviously were wrong, we take back to then in next versions of the software, update the model.
Great, thank you. I've got a question for you, Jose. In cases of atrial fibrillation, do you think ultimately you'd be able to identify areas where you would be able to successfully ablate the pulmonary veins and demonstrate success by showing circumferential lesions?
Okay, so I think there's two parts to that question. So let me try to break it down. The first part is whether we'll be able to do successful ablations for example, pulmonary vein isolation. I think that will depend a little on the technology of the ablator. So because at the moment, from the data that I've been able to see, I haven't been able to go into the lab to do one of these. I hope I can in the future. But what I see from the data is that the ablated area is quite large, and the scar tissue looks like overblown. And so it seems that the tools that we have haven't reached that level of refinement of just isolating carefully around. We did a clinical trial with Medtronic. We were the software partner, where they were testing their cryoablators. So what this is just like a balloon that they would put on the pulmonary vein, and they would freeze it so that would kill the tissue, and that would cause essentially the isolation of the pulmonary vein. I don't recall. I don't think there was a big difference. We haven't, unfortunately, we're still working with them to kind of like get those results in, and they were going to do all the analysis on all the post analysis of that. So I don't have numbers on that. So that's on the, will we be able to do it? The second part is, can we assess whether a pulmonary vein isolation has been done properly, which I think was the second part to your question. Is we are able to an extent with the software platform that I described. There's a little applet, there's a little plugin there where you can circle out the pulmonary vein isolation. You can set a few points on a model of the thing. It already has the scar signal embedded in it, and the thing will try to follow the most scarred tissue, and then it'll tell you, look, you have a gap here and you have a gap here, right? And it'll try to give you measurements of how well that is. And if we have that, and then that can be fed into an electrophysiological model that takes that information of scar tissue versus healthy tissue, you would be able to see very clearly that the electrical signal has been stopped or not. So
that's helpful, because obviously, I mean, one of the major problems with a successful atrial fibrillation ablation in the pulmonary veins is that you don't get a circumferential lesion, and you've got to go back in for a second procedure. Great, thank you very much for that. Tony, who has asked the question? I can't see the name. Tony Crick. I realise that you do not have an economic model for Spiro yet, but is there an opportunity to collaborate for CDCs? Julie?
Yeah, absolutely. We're working with a couple of them already, where we supported grant applications from their end. So definitely, if you just send me a quick email, I'll put you in touch with the colleague who's responsible for supporting primary care.
Lovely, thank you. Chris Jones has asked a question. Is jumping to say a suggestion of asthma or COPD from these tests the safest thing to do? I think there may be I think there may be a typo in there, which means that I can't understand the question. So, for example, the presence or absence of significant reversibility on a single diagnostic test does not include or exclude asthma and could mislead clinicians or practice nurses in primary care.
Yeah, I think this is a very good question, and I think that's why it's so important that you don't treat this AI as the God who knows everything about your patient. What it helps you to do is see signals in the test that you're performing. And so, for example, if you think of asthma, one of the things our report will always say is, think about phenotesting. Phenotesting is becoming much more available, especially in UK primary care, and is giving again good signals for asthma. I think you need to look at the full story of the patient. I think a nice example was from one of the studies we worked in, or one of the practices that we worked with in a project, was where there was a patient who was coming for spirometry, got their testing done, and the AI algorithm was giving a pretty big signal on interstitial lung disease. Now, of course, what you don't do is immediately put that patient on antifibrotic drug, which is hugely expensive, has a lot of side effects. Well, what the nurse did do is ask a couple of questions. And just in a couple of questions, it was revealed that the brother of that patient had recently died from pulmonary fibrosis. So then it's very important that you don't just put that patient, send the patient home with either exercise or some type of inhaler, but that you really expedite that patient to get an HRCT done at a site that is specialized in interstitial lung disease. And so I think that's what you need to do. You need to still treat the tool as a tool, and it's not taking over your decisions, but it's kind of a second pair of eyes, and to keep you alert and to be a bit more sensitive for signals that might be in the data.
Okay, thank you for that answer, Julie. Caroline Lee, I saw your hand flash up, raising your hand. Do you have a question that you want to raise? I mean, William, could you unmute Caroline Lee,
Yeah,
please?
I think it's fine. So probably we can keep in touch later on. But I think integrating different level of data into the model would be extremely valuable, because then you got a cross-validation across all sorts of different modality. In addition, it also help us to understand better what we are measuring using wearables, PPG, ECG, all sorts of things. Yeah. So look forward to probably catch up a bit more after this one.
Yeah, I think we could arrange a meeting offline. Jose knows where Northampton Square is.
All right.
Around.
Look forward to see you back.
Well, I don't see any more questions here, so just remains for me to thank Jose and Julie very much for their insightful presentations. Thank you all for joining, and also thank William for doing such a good job in setting up the technology for us to have this webinar today. So thank you all very much.
Hi, Stephen. Sorry, there's just been one more question come through on the chat section from Rebecca Nix.
I don't see that.
I can read it.
Is that in the chat or in the Q&A?
It's on the actual chat. Yes, not the Q&A.
Okay. I'm not looking at the chat. Here we go. Okay. There's a number of questions in here, so let's carry on. Okay, UK installations we've seen. Would the cloud location go out of the UK is a question.
I think that's a question for me. So I think there's two elements to a question. One is important to know that only anonymized data is sent to our cloud. So we don't take any patient ID, patient name, date of birth. And so our cloud is located in Germany and Ireland. So within the European Economic Area.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that. Fiametta Fidele, is it based on standard of care DICOM images? I would imagine that's for Jose.
So our platform supports DICOMs, of course. That's very standard. what we do normally, we convert the images that we import into we convert it to this other format called Nifty. One of the benefits is that it automatically anonymizes any lingering data that might be in the DICOM. But yeah, it's essentially DICOMs is the main point.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca Nix's question here: do you consider this to be SAMD or potential to develop as such if it is to become commercially available, and therefore is CE or UKCA marked? Is this something you're considering?
Rebecca, I assume by SAMD you mean the segment anything MD?
No, it's a standard software. It's software as a medical device, Jose.
Okay, that one. Sorry. There's only so many letters in English and then many acronyms. So potential to put our application as a software, as a medical device. I think it does have the potential. One of the main hurdles that we have with that is that it's completely open source, and because of that, and all the underlying libraries are open source as well. So we need to. It's very hard to go like we can ensure that our algorithms are to an extent up to par, but it becomes harder and harder as we go down all the libraries, the deeper libraries that handle the algorithms to guarantee that those are suitable as a medical device, because you need all of this testing, and you need all of this you need all the software to be very, very specific in what it does, and you need to be able to determine perfectly where are the boundaries of its limits of its capabilities. So that what we aim to do, we're aiming to check as many boxes as we can in terms of having a stable platform, making it robust, making it like interoperable, trying to check as many boxes as we can, and then once we get to a point where we can't move any longer, then we can see, okay, can we do this or not? Hopefully we can, but yeah.
Great, thank you. 2 questions from Fiametta. Fiametta says, I meant the sequences. Are they SOC imaging sequences or specific ones? And she goes on to say, I know, having worked with 3D printing, for example, we had to ask for specific MR sequences, not the same as those ones received on standard care.
Right. So normally that it's one of those questions that you answer with depends. It depends. Depends on the application, depends on what we're working on. We have worked with MRI, and then we will have a specific protocol that we need. We need a specific resolution for the voxel size. We need a specific we'll need a specific contrast, and then if sometimes we have a pipeline where sometimes we use cine MRI, sometimes we use 3D plus timing MRI, so that has a different resolution, that has a different way of getting acquired. So it mostly all depends on what application are we talking about, and what are the potential output that you want from that particular pipeline.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed. I think that exhausts the questions in both the chat and the Q&A. So again, thanks to all of you for attending. Thank you very much for the speakers. Really inspiring presentations, and I must thank William for organising the technology to have this all on board. If Jose and Julie and William could stay online, please, that would be great, just for a moment. And thank you, everybody else. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.
Everyone.